Welcome to the 19th century. You've made it this far. Hopefully you're finding the literature and poetry to get a little bit more accessible, a little bit more familiar, and I promise the 20th and 21st century will be even easier to sink your teeth into. So the poetry and narratives that we're reading this week emerged during a period of substantial economic and geographical growth in the United States. But this was also a period that was marked by extreme political conflict and uncertainty. The 19th century saw the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, rapid territorial expansion, and world-changing technological innovations like the railroad and photography. And all of these things animated the 19th century world of our writers. The United States was finding its place in the world after the American Revolution. As we've discussed in this course, people often understand a given place through the stories it tells about itself. Accordingly, the emergence of a distinctly American literature was crucial to establishing an American identity. In this period, authors as different as Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman were working to elevate American literature in an attempt to elevate the country. One of the defining features of 19th century American literature is this idea of American literary nationalism. So I mentioned that the United States was still a young country at the beginning of the 19th century, and many people who lived during that period were convinced that a sign of a great nation was the existence of a great national literature. So a country couldn't be a good country unless it could produce exceptional and original art. In keeping with that, writers in the 19th century attempted to produce American works as quickly as possible. Early representatives of this push towards American literary nationalism include Washington Irving's The Sketchbook, which holds stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Similarly, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans was understood to be a text that was advancing this idea of American literary nationalism. So works like these work to create what's called the Republican hero. This was a character who was anti-aristocratic, anti-monarchical, and a person from an obscure background who incarnated the strengths and virtues of the U.S. nation. So jumping forward 20 more years, we have even more familiar texts like Moby Dick, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and The Scarlet Letter, works that are understood to be foundational American texts. So as our text from this week suggest, American literature in this period focuses on imagination and individual psychology, as well as on the importance of history and location. Thoreau's Walden is an experimental prose work that blends elements from a wide range of genres, including autobiography, nature writing, social criticism, and utopian tracts. Similarly, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass represents a radical and self-conscious attempt to break with traditional poetic practices. At the same time, the equally innovative Emily Dickinson began her own career. In fact, so much important writing was produced during the 1850s that those years have been described as the American Renaissance. All of our readings from this week really kind of come from this moment. But at the same time that these authors were working to build a national identity, there were still a lot of questions and a lot of conflicts within the nation itself. So again, recycling the question, what is America and what is the place of American literature? Looking at two maps from the book in the 19th century, I think reflect the state of flux of the country quite well. If you look here on the left, we have a map of the U.S. in 1802. We have what had been the original 13 colonies, now states, largely in place here along the East Coast. We have the addition of some territory in Indiana and kind of Mississippi, Alabama down here. But what's west of the Mississippi is not part of the United States. Immediately west is the colony of Louisiana, which would have been New France, and then even further west was New Spain, what would have incorporated Texas to California. Looking at the end of the 19th century, however, we do see this familiar map. We have all of the states in place. Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Alaska, and Hawaii are not yet states, but they are incorporated territories within the nation. So over the course of 100 years, we have the geographical growth of the country from this into this. At the same time, the 19th century saw growing regional differences, especially surrounding the institution of slavery. As I mentioned last week, the most heated debate at the 18th century Constitutional Convention was about the legal status of slavery within the United States. Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence called slavery, quote, a cruel war against human nature itself. Writers like Phillis Wheatley and Olaudah Equiano similarly spoke out against the institution. The Founding Fathers, however, left slavery an open question. Thereafter, many northern states outlawed it, while southern states kept it legal. But as the U.S. expanded west in the 19th century, the legal state of slavery was an open question. But as the U.S. expanded west in the 19th century, the legal state of slavery in these new states became an open question, and ultimately this led to the Civil War. The piece we're reading from Harriet Jacobs speaks to the evils of 19th century slavery. Like Equiano and Occam from last week, she wrote her autobiography as a testament to the evils of slavery, and more particularly, the sexual oppression and sexual violence enslaved women were forced to endure. Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is one of the many slave narratives that were written in this period to bring about the end of slavery. There was also a growing abolitionist movement throughout the 19th century, where many people tirelessly worked to bring about the end of slavery. Ultimately, as you probably know, the end of the Civil War marked the end of the institution of slavery in the United States, but the Civil War did not fully resolve questions about race and citizenship, or the historical racism that pervades most of American history. At the same time, we see a growing women's movement. Women didn't have the right to vote in the 19th century, and this is also where we see the seeds of the prohibition movement to curb alcohol consumption. Slavery was the biggest issue of the day, but at the same time there was growing social activism and social reform movements that were part of the conversation as well. Between 1800 and 1900, Americans saw the world change in drastic ways, notably through the invention of the steam engine and locomotive, so the railroad. For the first time, people could travel at high speeds from one place to another. Before the invention of the railroad, the fastest way someone could get somewhere is on foot or by riding a horse, so the railroad revolutionized travel. The 19th century also saw the invention of photography. If you can imagine, before the 19th century, it was hard for people to know what other people looked like unless it was through detailed written descriptions or a painting that bore a certain likeness to another person. But photography was invented in the middle of the 19th century and revolutionized the way that people literally saw themselves. Similarly, we see the invention of the telegraph and the telephone, revolutionizing long-distance, high-speed communication. We see the invention of electricity, paper currency, and anesthesia, and each of these things were radical innovations in their given fields. Not only did the country look different at the beginning and the end of the 19th century, but on a local level, place to place, the media landscape looked drastically different. But even with all these new emerging technologies, the role of literature stayed quite constant. So in the 19th century, there was no television, there was no recorded sound, there were no sports. Basketball and football had not yet been invented. There was no mass media as we know it today. So for entertainment, people attended the theater and music halls on the weekends. Tickets tended to be pretty affordable for people to go. Churches and reform groups hosted parties and events. But for the day-to-day entertainment, people read. The printed word was the most portable kind of entertainment. People in Boston could read the same things as people in London. It was the emergence of mass culture. And accordingly, the 19th century saw a rise in newspapers, magazines, and other printed media. And this is the landscape in which Thoreau, Whitman, Poe, Dickinson, and Jacobs emerge. Literature was the center of arts and entertainment. It could have aesthetic ends, it could have political ends, but all of these writers were participating in the most prominent kind of media of the day. So Boston was one of the most important cities in the United States in the 19th century. It was a bustling place. 19th century Boston was a major hub of the abolitionist movement to end slavery. It was also a political and economic center for the rest of the country. Though other cities would get bigger and grow in importance in the 20th century, Boston held the pride of place until the end of the 19th century. And key for this class is understanding Boston's place in book production. So, along with Philadelphia and New York, Boston was a major book publishing center. Accordingly, it got to be a major exporter of literary culture to the rest of the country. So most of the books that were printed in the 19th century were printed in Boston. Some were also in Philadelphia and New York, but these three cities were producing literary culture in the 19th century. And each of our authors that we're reading for this week has some connection to Boston. So Poe was born in Boston, though he wasn't very proud of the fact. Harriet Jacobs lived in Boston after she escaped from slavery, and she's buried in a cemetery in Cambridge. Walt Whitman, though he was a proud New Yorker, he came to Boston to publish Leaves of Grass, his major artistic achievement, because he knew the publishers in Boston would do it right. So Thoreau's Walden is just outside of Concord, Massachusetts, not a 20-minute drive away. And Dickinson, who's the furthest from us, really isn't that far at all. She was writing her poetry in Amherst, Massachusetts. When you're reading each of our authors, I want you to think about how the local world of Boston might influence each of their texts. So is there something uniquely New England about Thoreau and Dickinson? Do their descriptions of the natural world seem similar to the nature that surrounds you? How does Thoreau's attitude towards socializing and cultural conventions relate to those of Bostonians today? So also keep in mind, authors like Harriet Jacobs and Walt Whitman, and Edgar Allan Poe for that matter, would have been writing their books and their stories with a Boston audience in mind. So not only was Boston a major publishing center, but Bostonians have long been the country's most voracious readers. So as you're reading, keep Boston in mind as you're reading this American national literature. So just a short lecture from me today. I hope you enjoy the reading. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments about our readings this week, and I'll see you in the 20th century next week.